All right, we'll get straight into it. I now welcome representatives of the Australia Institute to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Bill Brown, Director of the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability Program.
Thanks, Bill.
Sky Predovec, Researcher at the Australia Institute.
Thanks, Sky. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to appear before the committee. This Parliament has the opportunity to make Australian elections fairer, more transparent and more truthful. First of all, there are a series of straightforward reforms that would strengthen public trust and confidence. Implementing truth in political advertising laws, which are proven to work in South Australia and for which the Albanese government already has legislation prepared. Removing political parties from the postal vote process, which has already happened at the state level. Removing the spam and privacy privileges that allow political parties to share voters' personal information widely and send mass text message spam. And lastly on this, the changes to electoral law passed earlier this year were rushed and will make Australian elections less competitive. Integrity groups have already identified 6 ready reforms to make these laws better. And there are further steps available to strengthen Australia's democracy. Compulsory and preferential voting keep our politics broadly representative and participatory, but we can't afford to be complacent. The Commonwealth fine for not voting is equal lowest in the country, and a modest increase there is in order. Expanding the franchise, for example, to include 16 and 17-year-olds, like the United Kingdom is doing, or to include permanent residents, like New Zealand has already done, would mean more people living in Australia have a say in how it is governed. But perhaps the single most effective democratic reform open to this Parliament is a large increase in the number of parliamentarians. Most Australians don't feel confident approaching their local member and cannot name who that is. MPs are stretched thin over electorates of about 170,000 people on average, some much more, making less accessible and less accountable in terms of our democracy. A 50% increase in MPs and senators is warranted, and that would be headcount neutral if accompanied by a reduction in electorate staff from 5 per MP to 3 per MP. And in any case, the ACT and the Northern Territory should get at least 2 additional senators each, which would still leave them at only a third of what is enjoyed by Tasmania, 12. More MPs would mean more local concerns are better represented. It would mean a deeper talent pool for committee work and ministries, and it would mean regional and rural electorates become a more manageable size. And that's on top of other improvements to workload and accessibility for MPs. Thanks.
Thanks, Sky. I just had some questions about increasing the number of parliamentarians and some of the claims you made there in regards to representation. You've done some research on this in the past. Would you care to share some of that on evidence today?
Yes, I don't have the exact polling figures with me, but when we did ask Australians about their experience interacting with a local member, most couldn't name their local member, most hadn't interacted with their local member by phone or met them, and most wouldn't feel comfortable approaching their local member. So taken together, that suggests both that most Australians aren't finding it easy to access their local MP and are reluctant to even attempt to do so.
Common argument against increasing the size of Parliament is that we don't need any more politicians, or we don't want any more politicians. I guess what would be how would citizens benefit from having better representation? I know Sky outlined a bit of that, but did any of that come up in your research about deficiencies in the current system versus how that could be addressed if Parliament were expanded?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a vicious circle that without meeting your local member, it's hard to form a positive impression about them, and then you have a kind of innate scepticism towards parliamentarians that make you reluctant to have more of them. I think having local members be more accessible to the public and also more accountable to them, in the sense that a community campaign might seriously get their attention if they represent an electorate of 110,000 people instead of 170,000 people. It's also the case that the larger the parliament gets, the more representative it is. You're more likely to get local community figures stepping up into positions. It makes elected representatives more accessible than if your interaction is with an electorate officer who's not able to take your views to Parliament, is not able to directly reflect your views in legislating.
And you've mentioned a number of 50%. How have you come up with that number?
So that would restore representation to what it was like when there was the last increase in parliamentarians back in the 1980s. I think it would be possible to start with a smaller increase, but I'd be wary then that you take most of the political cost for increasing the number of parliamentarians for a reduced benefit. I think there's a strong case to be made for a large increase, and indeed the Parliament is of a size that it could accommodate. The actual rooms have been built to accommodate that number.
And have you calculated the nexus provisions? So that 50% increase of the Parliament, do you have those figures in your submission in regards to the increase of senators versus members?
Yeah, if not, we can provide the other research, but it would mean 18 senators per state, 9 elected at each general election.
And territories?
Territories, I guess, wouldn't have to increase, but I would think if you increase to 18 senators per state, you would want at least 6 senators per territory, but it would be open to the Parliament to choose a different number.
Thanks. Deputy Chair.
Thanks. I just want to go to the elements in your submission around truth in political advertising. You made some references to the South Australian laws. Where do you see the appropriate administration of that process? We've had quite a bit of evidence here this morning from a number of parties, not least the Electoral Commission themselves, about their role in that, and the previous witness as well, talking about maintaining trust in the Electoral Commission as an institution, which I think, well, my personal view is that's vital for the way that our system is managed. So how do you see the management of that concept coming into form if the Electoral Commission isn't the appropriate body to be doing that?
I'd say, I think at the outset, that I thought the Special Minister for State found a good working model in the legislation that the Albanese government put forward last year, where there would be a panel within the Electoral Commission but chaired by a former judge, made up of appointments that JSCEM had a role in, that could make the actual decisions on these on complaints about misleading advertising. That seemed to have the benefit of keeping the Electoral Commission proper somewhat insulated from the decisions of the panel, while still having the benefit of it being within the Electoral Commission, able to draw on the expertise and resources of the Commission. That said, if Parliament decided differently and wanted to give the Electoral Commission or a different body that responsibility, I think that would be appropriate as well. It is the case that Electoral Commissions have expressed reservations about being the ones responsible for regulating truth in political advertising. It is ultimately the courts that impose sanctions, not the Electoral Commission. That might be a nuance missed by some criticisms of the Commission if it makes decisions. But it's also the case that the ACT Electoral Commission was reluctant to have these responsibilities. Parliament still decided they were the best regulator. The South Australian Electoral Commission over the years has sometimes been uncomfortable with being the regulator. but it has done so well as the regulator that it's been impossible to move it to any other possible administrator. So I think even reluctant electoral commissions have proved to be good overseers of truth in political advertising laws.
How do we balance that with the freedom of political debate? How do we actually manage those things? Because sometimes some of the conversation is very nuanced and becomes a bit subjective in that sense. How do we ensure that we maintain the integrity of the actual voting electoral system while managing the expression of individuals, parties, whoever, that are participating in the process?
I think a key part of the truth in political advertising model that South Australia has developed is that opinion is protected, and it's only claims purporting to be statements of fact that are subject to these restrictions. And that has meant that there are court cases where some quite inflammatory and unkind language has been directed as part of the political debate, but without being in itself a claim of fact, hasn't fallen under these laws. I think that's an important distinction, and it means that, at least in my experience, when I've looked at examples from South Australia, they've been, for the most part, pretty clear-cut. In practice, if a figure is being misused or a claim's being made that can't be supported by evidence, not only is it obvious to the viewer, but I think it's typically obvious to the person who was propagating that claim as well. When the umpire makes a decision, people have almost always respected it because it's a fair call. On the very rare occasions that it might have to go to the courts, our courts are fact-finding institutions, including under very difficult circumstances, are able to take a step back and make objective decisions. So for the most part, the umpire's decision is respected, but there is that stopgap of the courts who exist to make findings of fact.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Senator Mulholland, did you have any questions?
Just a couple. In your submission, you talk about fixed terms, which is obviously receiving a bit of attention at the moment for the committee, with landing on a preference of 3 years due to the fact that there's no requirement for constitutional change. Can you just sort of elaborate a little bit on why you think 3 years would be the least worst option?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of 3 years, I think the need for a referendum to be any longer itself serves as a pretty powerful argument for 3 years. And indeed, I think it's good for politicians to have to face the public often. So I think 3 years is a good length. But making those 3 years fixed would give more certainty. I confess I hadn't thought about the demands on the AEC until it was raised today. But, for example, I've seen committees have to stop their inquiries before they've delivered their findings because the election timetable is uncertain. And, of course, it's an incumbency advantage too for the Prime Minister to be able to decide the timing of an election and to go when they appear to be on a high. I think too, of course, it would help public servants more generally and maybe some benefit to members of the Australian public as well, although, in practice I think people are able to adjust.
Excellent. And then I might just move to the proposal around increasing the number of elected officials. I think I said before, the Australian population has a sort of a healthy tolerance for democracy, and there are obvious cynical arguments that people would mount around not only the costs, but as I think the Chair said, how many more politicians is too many, and the average person would probably say one more is probably too many. So how do we overcome those challenges?
I think one starting point might be to emphasise that This means more competition for politicians. It means more competition for ministries and committee positions because the talent pool of Parliament is deepened. And it means more competitive electorates because a smaller change in the number of voters is enough to swing an election one way or the other. So I think starting by talking about how, in fact, incumbent politicians don't have a personal benefit from increasing their competitors is a potential place to start. I think then talking about the much higher legislative load that parliamentarians face these days and that ministers face, the fact that there are more ministers than there used to be, which means fewer backbenchers for things like committee work, can hopefully go some way to convincing Australians. Years ago, the Australia Institute did some polling research testing public receptiveness to more politicians, and while the majority, when just asked point blank, were opposed or uninterested, when describing just how many people a parliamentarian is expected to represent, you did see an increase in support for an increase. When people realise just how many other people are competing for their local members' attention, I think it becomes easier to make the case for more politicians.
And just on that, the point around the sheer number of people competing for attention, I know one of the proposals for a sort of a cost offset was talking about maybe reducing the number of staff. I suppose I would just say in that respect that, you know, the average number of sitting weeks per year is 20 weeks. So you've got the member or senator will be away for 20 weeks. Geographically, we increase the number of politicians, but the electorates are still quite large. And particularly where I come from, Queensland, there's a lot of territory to get across. You can have 90 schools in one electorate. So, and there's, you know, particularly for my colleagues in the House, there is a lot of pressure on those significant days of the year like Anzac Day, Remembrance Day, school presentation nights. You think about that across 40 RSLs or 90 schools. Reduction, I would argue reduction in staff is going to be, that proposal would be problematic for a service. I think if the problem is service delivery and trying to make people feel like they're getting adequate representation, staff do a significant amount of representation, particularly when the politician can't be there because they need to be in this space. So I would probably just table that for consideration at your end around the mechanics of operating in a political environment. The staff are really critical to what we do, and often people don't have just 5 staff, they have more that are funded out of allowances and trying to make that money just because the sheer volume of the work. So that might be just something to consider as part of future research. But that was all from me, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Mulholland. Dr. Ryan?
I know that the Australian Institute has previously and more recently expressed concerns about the potential impact of recent legislative changes around electoral donation laws and how they are likely to negatively impact independents and small parties. Would you like to speak to that issue, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the starting concern is with the process that was involved in making the changes, the lack of a detailed JSCAM inquiry, and we actually went back to the 1983 inquiry, which was the last, or which precipitated the last sweep of changes, of dramatic changes to electoral law, and it is remarkable how thorough and detailed that inquiry was, and we missed out on the opportunity to go into Australian electoral law and the effects of these changes in anything like this detail. I think there's several reasons to be concerned by the changes and that in total they make elections less fair. The restrictions on spending in an individual seat fall much more heavily on an independent candidate than they do on a political party because the $800,000 cap applies to the particular electoral expenditure of the independent candidate. But a political party, by doing general advertising promoting the party, not the candidate, can in effect spend in excess of that cap, dramatically in excess of that cap in some cases. I think there's also real concerns that the legislation will not succeed in reducing the overall amount of money spent on elections. The ability to split donations both over time, so a single donor can make 4 donations in an electoral cycle up to the cap and can do that across multiple party branches, means that in effect you still have the capacity to give over $1 million to a major party over an election cycle. The fact that nominated entities can transfer large amounts of money, and of course the increase in public funding to $5 per vote, which is $10 per voter if we assume that people vote the same way in the lower and upper houses, adds tens of millions of dollars of public funding. But the nature of how public funding works in Australia is that you only get the money after the election has already happened, which means that a new entrant is effectively dependent on private funding, which is one reason why the major parties have proven willing to limit the ability to raise private funds, because they have many other sources of funding outside of political donations.
Thank you. Could you speak as well perhaps to how the donation caps might be particularly disadvantageous to new candidates as opposed to incumbents, particularly those from parties?
So I think as well as the donation splitting, and there's a key temporal element here in that an independent candidate might start running 6 months out from an election, whereas a political party is a going concern over the 3 years. And so while theoretically an independent candidate could take 4 donations up to the cap from a donor, in practice a candidate who only becomes interested in running a year out might only be eligible for 1 or 2 donations from the same donor. I think then, aside from that, is the concern that a political party can charge a levy on its MPs and staff, which is not open to a new candidate. It may have accumulated assets, and of course it has the public funding from previous runs, all of which make it very hard. There's also the element of the advantages of incumbency, that someone who's already in a seat has, we calculate something like $5 million worth of entitlements over their term. Not all of those are brought to bear in an election, but a communications budget is very useful, a travel allowance very useful, an office and the promotion that goes along with it, all very useful, which means that they have a head start that a challenger, whether an independent or from a party, would need private funds in order to overcome.
Thank you. And perhaps could you just speak perhaps as well to the fact that the parties have nominated entities and how they can use them to in an advantageous way in managing their finances?
Yeah, so we see the nominated entity provisions also in Victoria, where they're the subject of constitutional challenge, and in South Australia, although we haven't had an election yet in which they've been in place. And because the nominated entity acts outside of the donation cap rules that apply to other entities, in practice they can contribute sums well beyond the $50,000 cap. But in effect, these are grandfathered in, because once the donation caps are in place, other entities won't be able to accumulate, other parties won't be able to accumulate the assets that would allow that kind of nominated entity arrangement.
So would you agree, Mr Brown, that the recent electoral donation reforms, which were agreed upon by the major parties, were aimed at specifically decreasing the or having a specifically negative impact on the electoral chances of small parties and independents?
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Dr Ryan. Mr Newman, did you have a question?
No, I don't have
No, you're all good.
questions,
Thank you. Jules, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just have one really quick question, please. And it's just on the section of your submission with respect to political participation. There's a few recommendations in there, and one of them is shorter voting periods. So shorter voting periods, increasing of fines, and then the potential for voluntary voting from people who are 16 to 18. And I wanted to get an understanding of this because they seemed counterintuitive to me in terms of shorter voting periods, shortening the length of people to be able to access the ability to go to a polling place. And when that's put together with an increasing of a fine, certainly we know that people who might not be able to turn out are more likely to be some of the most vulnerable in our community, whether they have barriers to be able to get there, whether they, might be, working multiple jobs while, trying to look after the kids, and that makes it more challenging. So what I kind of couldn't put together in that is, I think if you were driving towards more participation, you'd be, the logical thing would be to say, hey, let's have more opportunity for people to vote, and then not have a punitive kind of hit on them in terms of, a fine at the same time when we, know that they're the most vulnerable. I mean, the challenges in terms of suggesting any form of voting that is non-compulsory is that it also goes to the sort of thin end of the wedge in terms of compulsory voting, which I think, everyone that we've seen today has made very clear that is a really important pillar of our democracy. So I couldn't reconcile those, and I'm interested in what the objective of it is if it's not to increase participation, because they don't kind of collectively seem like they would actually increase participation. In fact, potentially, for some of them, the opposite.
Yeah, so I think I'd say that in part it's just that there are trade-offs, and those are difficult things to balance. I think our concern with the growing trend of early voting and postal voting is that it leads people to not witness the entire election campaign and not see the would-be leaders of the country put under scrutiny for that entire campaign. And possibly that you lose something a bit more ephemeral, but about coming together as a country on a single day to make a momentous decision. I think we haven't specifically recommended a shorter voting period, but that this loss of election day as a distinct kind of moment is something that people should, that politicians should think seriously about when setting policy arrangements. Of course, shortening the voting period, which happened 2 elections ago, didn't succeed in stopping the rise in early voting. So it's clearly not sufficient in and of itself. I don't think a $40 fine for not voting is unreasonable. Any fine that's a fixed amount falls more heavily on those with lower incomes than it does those with higher incomes. But also, the cost to a community, a disenfranchised community, from not turning out is greater. So you kind of have this collective involvement. We see that with improvements in pension levels of the pension, for example. When compulsory voting came in, older people who used to vote in lower numbers started voting in greater numbers with compulsory voting, and the effect was actually a financial benefit for pensioners across the board. Disadvantaged communities, people who feel disenfranchised, if they don't turn out, the whole community is affected by the lack of their participation. So I think, $40 is not a great impost. It's lower than most other fines, and it has this pro-social benefit.
No, thank you. That was it for me. But I should flag that on page 3 it says, for example, by further shortening the early voting period. That's what I was referring to in the submission.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Mr. Burnell, you good?
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, I just wanted to go back to comments around the value of incumbency. So you drew correlations around the cost, the advantage of comms budget, travel, etc. So are you proposing a reduction in that? Like, are you saying that there is an unfair advantage having been an elected member, and thereby there's an expectation to curtail activities by an incumbent member that then sits within a framework that creates a level of fairness? I'm a little bit lost on that, because I would have thought that the realisation from the general public is that an incumbent member, by nature of being voted in a previous election, has the advantage of being the incumbent, not to be seen as a disadvantage. I'm a bit lost with that line of thinking.
Yeah, so I think there's room to disagree on what kind of natural incumbency benefits should fall to someone. We've given examples in other places of business and sport where there are active attempts to overcome incumbency benefits to create a level playing field. But in politics, there are benefits that come from having been a candidate before, from having experienced the system, from having name recognition, and so on. Where our kind of enumeration of the advantages of incumbency, I think, is most significant, though, is that when Parliament limits the ability of everyone to fundraise across the board and limits the ability of everyone to spend, then the effect is that those who have those incumbency advantages cannot be challenged by private money that would match those benefits or would seek to overcome those benefits. So it's when you actually have a legislative interference that I think the greatest concern arises, although people could argue that it would be important to limit incumbency advantages that arise more naturally or that are inherent to the position.
But isn't it fair to say, though, that an incumbent member or senator has a right to go about their business as an elected official and communicate with their constituency base, whether that be in an electorate or the broader state? Because effectively that's what we are given when we're given the nod at an election via the larger number of votes, whether you're an independent, whether you're a party member or not. Like, that is what is afforded with being a successful candidate at an election previous. So you're saying that that should not apply moving forward? I'm really struggling with that proposition.
We're not suggesting that. I think it's useful to enumerate just how substantial the advantages of incumbency are, because I'm not sure that that's been done before. Previously, it's kind of been discussed as discrete things and not taken together as a total. But we haven't, in fact, even recommended reducing the advantages of incumbency, but rather that knowing that there are these advantages of incumbency, that should affect how Parliament legislates, and to fail to take into account those advantages of incumbency by imposing, for example, a uniform cap on expenditure that doesn't reflect the hundreds of thousands of dollars of communication budget that one person has the advantage of, that's when it becomes a real problem.
Hang on, let me be clear here. Those budgets that we are afforded as elected members of Parliament are for the purpose of carrying out the duties that we've been elected to do. That's distinctively different to what we're talking about here. So you are...
About doing our job as being an advantage. I think that's what we're trying to understand. Why is doing our job an advantage?
I think two things can be true, both that you are doing your jobs and that it gives you an advantage.
But then the flip side of the argument, though, is that regardless of your budget, if you are performing poorly, you potentially will get knocked off at the next election anyway. If you have a quality candidate running a quality campaign against you, no amount of money will stop a change in voting intention, potentially.
I think potentially, but it's also the case that most incumbents, I think 90%, win re-election, so it certainly helps. Money isn't everything, but it's also not nothing, and money both under the current system and increasingly under the changes that were legislated this year, help advantages incumbencies and major parties at the expense of other competitors in the electoral system.
Okay, I've just got one last question, if I can. I'm just going to change tack a bit here. I'm interested in the participation question and how can unhealthy forms of participation, such as intimidation and threats of violence, be discouraged? Like, what can we do better to ensure that we have better voter experience?
Yeah, I think I'm glad that the committee is looking at these issues. Personally, I had a very pleasant voting experience, but you can see on social media and news reporting, or indeed there have been reports, Mr Dreyfus talking to Parliament about concerns with behaviour on election booths. I think part of these problems are cultural, and a legislative solution probably doesn't exist to them, but rather it's about calling out bad behaviour where it occurs. I think Australian voters do extract a political price for bad behaviour, and I don't think it's necessarily rewarded. I don't think it necessarily works out for those who are involved in it. I'm certainly interested in what the committee finds. One area that we have looked at, of course, is truth in political advertising, and I think that would help raise the quality of debate. It's not decisive by itself, but we know from South Australia that having those laws means that decisions are taken at higher levels about what ads to approve, and there's a kind of greater sense of responsibility that comes along with that. That may have flow-on effects to other kind of vitriolic advertising, even if it's not technically misleading.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.